The wagon stopped at the edge of nothing. Ottilie Voss sat in the back, both children pressed against her sides, and looked out at what her husband had left her. 160 acres of Nebraska prairie. Grass as high as a man's shoulder stretching in every direction until the earth curved away and the sky swallowed everything whole. No house, no well, no broken ground. Just grass and wind and the kind of silence that makes a person feel very small and very alone at the same time. It was the first week of August, 1887. The air smelled of dry earth and something else, something older, something she had no name for yet. The sun was still high and brutal. Casper, her son, sat beside her without speaking. He was 6 years old and had already learned that some moments did not call for words. Liesel, 4 years old, held a grasshopper she had caught somewhere along the road. She watched it with complete concentration, as if the insect were the only thing in the world that made any sense. Ottilie climbed down from the wagon. She stood on the ground and felt the grass brush against her skirt. The driver, a man named Pryor who hauled goods between the settlements, had already turned his team around. He had said almost nothing on the 3-day journey from the rail station. He said nothing now. He simply left the wagon wheels cutting 2 faint lines through the grass, and then those lines disappeared too, and Ottilie was alone with her children on a piece of land she had never seen before, in a future she could no longer picture. She looked at what remained of her life. 2 children, a cast iron cook stove, bedding for 3, kitchen implements, a shovel with a cracked handle, an axe, a handsaw, enough dried corn and salt pork to last perhaps a month if she was careful, if she was very careful. Harlan had taken the horse. He had taken it 3 weeks earlier on a morning that had begun like every other morning. She woke to the sound of birds. She started the fire. She went to call him for breakfast, and he was not there. The horse was not in the pen. The $42 they kept in the tin box beneath the floorboard was gone. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. Everything else, everything that belonged to both of them together, was still exactly where it had always been, as if he had simply stepped out for an hour and not come back. She had waited 2 days before accepting what had happened. She had waited another week before she allowed herself to think clearly about what came next. The land claim was in her name. This was the detail that confused her neighbors back in the settlement where they had been living. Why would a man file a claim and put it in his wife's name? It made no sense to any of them. They offered theories. They offered sympathy. What they could not offer was help because none of them had enough to spare. Ottilie had thought about it on the long journey west, sitting in the back of Pryor's wagon, with Casper asleep against her shoulder and Liesel curled at her feet. She had turned the question over and over like a stone, examining every side. And somewhere in the long, empty miles between the settlement and Custer County, she had arrived at the answer. Harlan had not left the land in her name out of generosity. He had left it in her name because it had no value yet. Under the Homestead Act, a claim only became yours after 5 years of residence and improvement. The land had to be lived on. It had to be worked. It had to be built upon. Harlan had paid the $18 filing fee and done nothing else. No house, no well, no broken ground. The claim was worthless in its current state, and if it failed, whoever held the title held the debt of failure. He had not abandoned her. He had transferred the risk to her and walked away. This was the thing she understood sitting in the back of that wagon, and understanding it did not make her angrier. It made her quieter. There is a kind of anger that burns hot and loud and exhausts itself quickly. And there is another kind that settles into the bones and becomes something else over time. Something harder. Something that does not burn out because it does not burn at all. It simply waits. Ottilie was 29 years old. She had been born in the Saxon lowlands, the daughter of a man who built things with his hands and a mother who kept a household running on almost nothing. She had come to America at 15, following her family across an ocean toward a future that was supposed to be better than the one they were leaving behind. She could not read English. She could not write it. When she signed documents, she used an X, the same mark her mother had made in the old country, the same mark her grandmother had made before that, a mark that meant, I am here. I exist. This thing is mine. She had signed the land claim with that X. And now she was here standing on the land it represented with two children and a cook stove and $2.60 in her pocket. The first night they slept in the wagon, Casper did not ask where their house was. He helped his mother lift Liesel into the wagon bed and arrange the blankets without being told. He had his father's eyes in his mother's silence, and in the weeks since Harlan left, the silence had grown heavier in him. He was 6 years old, and he had already decided that certain questions were not worth asking. This was not a thing that should happen to a 6-year-old. But the prairie did not consult anyone on what should and should not happen. Liesel still had the grasshopper when she fell asleep. The second day, Ottilie walked the claim. She walked it in long, slow lines the way her father had walked fields back home when he was assessing ground before he built something. She was not her father. She had never built anything larger than a chicken coop. But she had watched him her whole childhood, and watching carefully is its own kind of education. The grass was dense, not just tall, but thick at the roots matted together in a way she had not expected. When she stopped and pushed her fingers down into the soil, she could feel the root system running in every direction, woven together like rope, holding the earth in a single continuous mass. She pulled at a clump of sod and it came up in one piece, trailing dirt but refusing to crumble. The root structure held it together from the inside. She had seen something like this before. When she was 11, her father had built a root cellar behind their house in Saxony. He had not used stone or timber for the walls. He had cut blocks of earth from the meadow and stacked them like bricks. The neighbors had laughed. Her father was not a man who responded to laughter. He finished the cellar and it lasted 20 years. The walls never shifted. They never cracked. In summer, the cellar stayed cool. In winter, it never froze. And her father had explained to her once, in the patient way he explained things he considered obvious, that the earth itself was the insulation. That what was inside the earth stayed apart from what was outside it, and the thicker the wall, the more completely that separation held. She had been 11 years old and she had understood. She was 29 years old, standing on 160 acres of Nebraska prairie, and she remembered. On the third day, the neighbor came. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. She was at the cook stove, which she had set up outside the wagon on the flattened grass, when she heard hoofbeats coming from the north. She turned and watched the rider approach. He was a large man, not tall exactly, but broad, with a white-edged beard, and hands she could see from 20 yards away were the hands of someone who had done hard physical labor for most of his life. He rode at an unhurried pace, the pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, but intended to arrive exactly when he chose. He stopped his horse and looked at the wagon, the cook stove, the two children who had come to stand near their mother. He looked at the empty claim stretching in every direction. He took his time. Then he looked at Ottilie. His name was Rutherford Krug. He was 54 years old. He had come to Custer County in 1878 and survived 9 Nebraska winters, which was a specific kind of credential that meant something on the Great Plains. He had helped build more than 20 sod houses, always with crews of 3 or 4 men, always with horses and breaking plows to cut the sod in proper strips. He dismounted the way old men do when their knees have seen too many winters slowly, and with deliberate care, and he stood beside his horse and continued to look at everything before he said anything. "You are the woman from the Voss claim," he said. It was not a question. Ottilie told him that she was. He walked the perimeter of where a house might reasonably go, kicking at the sod with his boot, testing the grass density the way she had tested it with her fingers 2 days earlier. He was doing the same calculations she had done, reading the same information from the same ground, arriving at a set of conclusions he had arrived at many times before. When he came back to where she stood, his expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man who is about to say something that needs to be said and who has learned over the course of a long life that saying it clearly is more merciful than softening it. He told her what she was facing. A sod house required cutting an acre of prairie into bricks. Each brick weighed 50 pounds, sometimes more when wet. The walls had to be 2 feet thick and 7 feet tall. Hundreds of bricks cut and hauled and stacked and leveled. The ridgepole alone required 3 strong men to lift into position. A crew with horses and a breaking plow could build a sod house in a week. A woman alone with no horse and no plow could not build one at all. He paused there and let the arithmetic speak for itself. Then he asked if she had money. $2, she told him, and 60 cents. He absorbed this the way a man absorbs the news that confirms what he already suspected. He nodded slowly. A frame house cost $600 in lumber, he said, shipped from Iowa. A hired crew to build a sod house cost $25. He said these numbers the way a doctor recites a diagnosis, not to be cruel, but because the facts had to be faced before anything useful could happen. Ottilie said nothing. She had already done this arithmetic herself. Rutherford Krug looked at Casper, who was watching him from a careful distance with the wary steadiness of a child who has learned to read adult conversations for information they may not intend to share. He looked at Liesel, who had found another grasshopper and was following it through the grass with her complete attention. He looked back at Ottilie. "You cannot build a house alone," he said. "Not a frame house, not a sod house, not any house." He paused. What came next was harder. "You should find a husband quickly, a man with a claim already proved, or sell this land for whatever you can get, $20, maybe 30, and use the money to travel back east before September ends, before the cold comes." Ottilie waited. "If you stay," Rutherford continued, "you will need to build. If you try to build alone, you will fail. If you fail, winter will come anyway." He did not look at the children again. He had already looked at them and drawn his conclusion and did not need to look again. A woman alone cannot cut sod-raised walls and set a ridgepole before the cold. You will freeze in that half-built structure, and your children will freeze beside you. He mounted his horse. He was not a cruel man. He had built his reputation on the prairie by being direct, and directness had served him well in a place where soft words and delayed decisions got people killed. He was not trying to discourage her. He was trying to save her life. "I have seen it before," he said. "Newcomers who think the prairie is generous. The prairie is not generous. It takes what you have, and then it takes what you do not have. Sell the land. Go east. Do not let pride kill your children." He rode away without looking back. Ottilie stood beside the wagon and watched him disappear into the grass. The sound of hoofbeats faded. The wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. Casper came and stood beside her. He did not ask what the man had said. He had heard enough. "Mama," he said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Ottilie looked at the empty prairie. She looked at the wagon that was not theirs. She looked at her son, who was 6 years old, and already understood that the world did not grant second chances to people who looked like them. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the most honest answer she had. She spent that night sitting beside the wagon after the children slept, drawing figures in the dirt with a stick. The moon was high and bright enough to see by. She could hear the distant sound of something moving in the grass, an animal, small, probably harmless, going about its own business in the dark. A standard sod house was 14 feet by 16 feet walls, 2 feet thick, 7 feet tall. She did not know precisely how many bricks that required, but she knew it was more than 200. More than 300 if you included the walls for the gable ends and the interior supports. More than she could cut and haul and stack alone in any reasonable amount of time. She erased the figures and started again. What if the house was smaller? Not a house meant to be comfortable. Not a house meant to impress anyone. A house meant to keep 3 people alive through one Nebraska winter. That was the only requirement. That was the only standard that mattered. 10 feet by 12, barely larger than the wagon bed. She drew the dimensions in the dirt. The walls would still need to be 2 feet thick because the thickness was the point. The thickness was what she had remembered from her father's cellar. But what if the walls only needed to rise 5 feet above the ground instead of 7? And what if she dug down first 2 feet below the surface so the floor of the house was lower than the surrounding prairie? Then the walls only needed to reach 5 feet above that lower floor. The total wall height was still 7 feet, but the part she had to build above ground was only 5. It was not a smaller house. It was a smarter house. The earth itself would form 2 of those 7 feet. She counted on her fingers. Estimated, a standard house needed 300 bricks or more. Her house might need 180, still an enormous number for one woman working alone. Still perhaps impossible, but less impossible. And less impossible was somewhere to begin. The ridgepole was the other problem. Rutherford Krug had been explicit. 3 strong men to lift it into position. She had seen enough construction in her life to believe him. A single beam spanning 10 feet heavy enough to support a sod roof loaded with snow was not something one person could lift into place. But what if there was no single beam? She thought about the willow trees growing along the creek bed 3/4 of a mile to the east. She had seen them on her second day walking the claim. Thin, flexible poles, each one light enough for her to carry. One pole was useless. But 3 poles lashed tightly together created something different. Something that distributed weight differently. Something that might hold what a single beam would hold at a fraction of the weight. She was not an engineer. She had no training in construction of any kind beyond what she had absorbed by watching her father work. But she had watched carefully, and she understood in the practical way that people who build things with their hands understand that the goal was not strength. The goal was structure. Strength could be assembled from weakness if the weakness was arranged correctly. The plan took shape in the dirt. She erased it and drew it again. She changed the dimensions twice. She recounted the bricks. The numbers did not add up to certainty, but they added up to something she could attempt. Something that was worth attempting, because the alternative was to do what Rutherford Krug had told her to do, and the alternative was not something she was willing to consider. She still had no horse, no plow, no help. But she had 2 hands. She had 12 weeks before the first hard freeze, maybe 14 if the weather held. And she had 2 children who would not survive the winter in a wagon. She went to sleep. 2 days later, Dorothea Fenwick arrived with the basket. She came from the north, the same direction Rutherford Krug had come from, riding a spotted mare with an easy gait. She was 38 years old, the wife of Ambrose Fenwick, the mother of 4 children who had survived infancy on the Nebraska prairie, which was not something every family could say. She lived 2 miles north in a frame house her husband had built with the help of 3 neighbors the summer before. She had heard about the woman on the Voss claim. Everyone had heard. She handed Ottilie the basket and said it was for some mending if she had the time. It was not a trade. They both knew it. But frontier charity required the pretense of an exchange, and Ottilie accepted the fiction along with the food. Dorothea climbed down from her horse and walked the claim with Ottilie and listened to the plan. The small dimensions, the dug-down foundation, the bundled ridge poles instead of a single beam. When Ottilie finished explaining, Dorothea was quiet for a moment. She was a practical woman who had survived on the prairie long enough to have heard a great many plans that sounded reasonable and turned out to be catastrophic. "It's half the size of any dwelling in the county," she said finally. "It only needs to keep 3 people alive," Ottilie said. "You'll need at least 100 trips hauling sod from the cutting site to the building site. You have no wagon, no sledge, just a canvas tarp, I know. The roof poles have to rest on something at the wall tops. You'll need supports, and you'll need them to be level. I know. What happens if you get sick?" If one of the children gets sick while you're in the middle of building, Ottilie did not argue. Every concern Dorothea raised was real. Every one of them could be the thing that stopped her. "I have no other choice," Ottilie said. If I don't try, we lose the claim and freeze anyway. If I try and fail, at least we tried in a place that might have been home. Dorothea looked at the empty claim. She looked at the two children playing near the wagon. She looked at the woman standing in front of her, already sunburned from 3 days of walking the land, already calloused from 2 days of digging a foundation that might never hold walls. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small jar of something. For your hands, she said. The blisters will crack if you don't treat them. I'll take it. I can't lend you a horse. We need both for harvest. I understand. Dorothea rode home that evening and told her husband about the woman on the Voss claim. Ambrose shook his head. She'll be gone by September, he said. They always are. But Dorothea was not certain. She had seen something in Ottilie's face that was different from the usual expressions of desperate newcomers. Not confidence exactly, not even hope. Something harder than both of those things. The look of someone who has already accepted the worst possible outcome and decided to work anyway. That woman will either prove us all wrong, Dorothea said, or she'll prove us right. Either way, we'll know by January. 10 days after she arrived on the claim, Ottilie walked the 4 miles into town. The settlement of Garfield was the kind of place that wanted to be a town, badly enough that it had already built the structures of one, a general store, a land office, a small church made of wood that had warped in its first summer, and a scattering of houses along a single dirt street. The optimism of frontier settlements had a specific quality to it, a brightness that existed in direct proportion to the bleakness of the surrounding landscape, as if the act of naming a place and putting up a few buildings could convince both the residents and the prairie that permanence was possible. The general store belonged to Cornelius Croft. He was 45 years old, an American-born, with the soft hands of a man who had never cut sod or hauled water or done anything that left permanent marks on his body. He owned the store. He also held mortgages on several claims in the county and had acquired 3 failed homesteads in the past 2 years, not through malice exactly, but through the patient recognition that other people's failures created opportunities for people who had enough capital to wait. He had heard about the woman on the Voss claim. He had been watching that claim for months, since before Harlan Voss disappeared, because Harlan had borrowed against it and the paperwork was not entirely clean. Ottilie entered the store with $2.60 in her pocket and a list in her head. Window glass, nails if she could afford them, nothing else. She found the window panes stacked against the back wall, small rectangles of glass that would let light into a house that did not yet exist. Mrs. Voss, Cornelius said from behind the counter. He pronounced her name without the European softness it was supposed to have. I heard about your situation. He leaned against the counter. People are talking, saying you're building out there by yourself. That right, Ottilie brought a pane to the counter. 8 inches by 12 inches, $1.12, according to the hand-lettered sign. A house that size won't hold heat, Cornelius said. Won't hold a family through a Nebraska winter either. He picked up the coins she placed on the counter, one at a time slowly. I could take that claim off your hands. $20. That's more than you'll have if the cold comes before the roof does. Ottilie waited for her change. I've seen women in your situation before. Cornelius wrapped the glass in brown paper, taking his time. Pride keeps them working until the cold takes their fingers. Their children. Their lives. He slid the package across the counter. Sell now while you still have the strength to walk away. Ottilie took the wrapped glass. She did not thank him. She walked out of the store and began the long walk back to her claim, carrying a piece of her future in her hands. $1.12 worth of light, bought with money she could not afford to spend for a house that everyone said would fail. Behind her, Cornelius Croft watched through the store window. He was a patient man. He could wait. The foundation took 4 days. She dug 2 feet down across a 10 by 12-foot rectangle, piling the excavated earth to one side for later use. The cracked shovel she had arrived with lasted 1 day before the handle split completely. She finished the foundation with the better shovel Dorothea had lent her, working in the early morning when the ground was coolest and the children were still asleep in the wagon. By midday, the heat was too much to work in without water, and her water supply required careful management. She worked in the morning, rested in the heat of the afternoon, worked again in the long summer evenings until the light failed. Casper tried to help. He could not cut sod. His arms were not long enough and his weight was not enough to drive the shovel blade into earth that had been locked together by root systems for decades. But he hauled things. He carried small tools from one place to another. He held stakes while his mother measured. He watched Liesel when Ottilie needed both hands free. He was 6 years old, and he approached the work with the same wordless seriousness he had brought to everything since his father left. On the fifth day, Ottilie began cutting sod. She sliced vertical lines into the prairie 12 inches apart, then horizontal lines every 18 inches, creating bricks she could lift. The grassroots fought her with every cut. Each brick required a dozen strokes of the blade and then a hard prying motion to break it free from the surrounding earth. She loaded the bricks onto the canvas tarp, 3 at a time, 4 if she pushed herself, and dragged the tarp to the building site. The canvas left trails in the grass like marks left by something large moving through. After a week, the trails had worn down to bare dirt. Her hands blistered on the second day of cutting. The blisters broke on the fourth. By the end of the second week, the skin had hardened into something that no longer felt pain the same way. She used Dorothea's salve every night, working it into the cracks between her fingers, wrapping her hands in strips of cloth while she slept. The walls began to rise. First course, second course, third. Each course was 4 inches of height. The sod bricks interlocked like a rough masonry, each layer offset from the one below, each brick pressed tight against its neighbors, the joints filled with loose soil and small clumps of grass that wove together as the weeks passed. The foundation pit gave her 2 feet of depth before the walls even started. She was building upward from a lowered floor, which meant the walls needed to reach only 5 feet above the surrounding grade to achieve the 7 feet of total height that would make the interior livable. By the end of the third week, the walls were 2 feet tall above the ground. She could stand in the pit and see over them. The prairie stretched in every direction, indifferent to her labor, beautiful in the way that things that can kill you are sometimes beautiful. The grass moved in long, rolling waves when the wind came through, and in the late afternoon light, it turned a color that had no exact name in any language she knew. She had no time to look at it for long, but she looked at it sometimes just for a moment, just long enough to remember that the land itself was not her enemy. The land was simply the land. It did not care whether she succeeded or failed. It would still be here either way. That was in a strange way the most encouraging thing about it. What she was doing was not a battle. She was not fighting the prairie. She was asking it for something, and whether she received it depended entirely on whether she asked correctly. She kept cutting. She kept hauling. The walls kept rising. At night when the children slept, she sometimes sat outside beside the low lines of the growing walls and touched the bricks with her hand. They were cool in the evening air, solid, fixed. They did not shift when she pressed against them. The roots inside them held. She had placed every single one of them herself, cut them and dragged them and set them in position and tamped them level with a flat board. 120 of them so far. 60 more to go before the walls reach their final height. Then the roof, then winter, then whatever came after winter. She did not think past that. She had found over the past weeks that thinking past the immediate task was a kind of luxury she could not afford. Each day had its own requirements. Each brick had its own weight. She gave everything she had to what was directly in front of her and trusted that the days would accumulate into something that looked eventually like a life. Casper came and sat beside her one evening. He leaned against the low wall of the house they were building together. He ran his hand along the rough surface of the sod bricks the same way she had been doing. "Is it going to be warm?" he asked. Ottilie looked at the walls around them. She thought about her father's cellar in Saxony. She thought about what she understood and what she did not understand and about the difference between those two things. Yes, she said. She meant it, not as a promise, as a fact. As something she had held in her hands and understood with her body standing on this land for 3 weeks with a cracked shovel and a canvas tarp, learning what the earth could do. The work had a rhythm to it, not a pleasant rhythm, not the kind that made the hours pass easily or the body forget what it was carrying, but a rhythm nonetheless. Cut, haul, stack, rest, cut again, haul again, stack again. The repetition was its own kind of structure, and structure was what kept a person moving when movement was the only thing standing between her children and the cold. September came in hot and dry, the kind of September that tricks people into thinking summer will never end. The grass turned from green to gold at the tips, and the light changed, softening at the edges, arriving later in the morning and leaving earlier in the evening. These were small changes, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. Adelie was paying attention to everything. Her body had changed too. By the end of the 4th week, her dress hung loose on her frame. She had been giving Casper and Liesel the larger portions at every meal and telling herself she was not hungry. And after enough days of telling herself this, she had almost started to believe it. But the window glass she had not yet installed told her a version of the truth. When she passed by the pane where it leaned against the growing wall, she caught her reflection distorted and dark and saw cheekbones that had not been visible when she arrived in August. She noted this the way she noted everything, filed it somewhere practical, and kept working. Casper had grown quieter as the weeks passed. Not a troubled quiet, a focused one. He had stopped asking questions that had no good answers and started asking questions that did. How deep do you cut before you pry? Why do you offset each row instead of stacking them straight? What makes the corners stronger? Adelie answered every question as precisely as she could. She was teaching him without intending to, and he was learning without making a production of it, and this was one of the things about her son that made the days bearable. Liesel was 4 years old and had a different relationship with the work entirely. She could not cut sod, she could not haul it, but she refused to be still. She followed Adelie everywhere, handing her small tools, chattering in the mixed German and English that children develop when they live between two languages, occasionally attempting to drag a brick that outweighed her by 30 pounds. One evening, Adelie looked up from setting a course and saw Liesel pulling a half brick across the dirt by herself, leaning into it, with her whole small body leaving a furrow in the ground. Adelie put down her tools. She went and took the brick from her daughter's hands and held the child for a long moment without speaking. The walls were 3 feet tall by the middle of September. 12 courses of solid brick stacked and leveled the interior of the pit, now fully enclosed on all 4 sides. Adelie could stand on the floor of the foundation and see the top of the walls at roughly chest height. 4 more feet needed above the ground. 60 more bricks. Then the rain came. It began on a Tuesday evening with a shift in the wind and a smell in the air that Adelie recognized from childhood. She moved everything she could under the wagon canvas before dark. She banked the cook stove and covered it with a piece of tin she had saved from a discarded can. She looked at the walls one last time in the fading light and went to sleep, telling herself they would be fine. By morning, the rain was steady and serious. By the second day, it was continuous, the kind of rain that does not pause to let the ground recover, that simply keeps arriving in gray sheets from a sky that has forgotten any other color. The prairie became a shallow sea. The cutting ground turned to soup. The clay soil that Adelie had been slicing into bricks absorbed the water and swelled and became something that could not be cut or hauled or stacked. She and the children stayed in the wagon. Casper read to Liesel from the single book they owned, a German primer, with illustrations that had been handled so many times the edges were soft as cloth. Liesel listened and looked at the pictures and occasionally fell asleep and woke again and asked for the same story twice. She kept the grasshopper she had been carrying for weeks in a small jar beside her, checking on it with the same serious attention she brought to everything. Adelie sat at the open end of the wagon watching the rain, watching her walls. The walls were absorbing water. She could see it happening. The exposed top course darkened as the rain hit it. The outer faces of the bricks turned from the dry, sandy color she had been looking at for weeks to a deep, wet brown. And then she saw what she had been afraid of seeing. Movement. Slow, almost imperceptible, but real. The walls were settling under their own weight, the waterlogged bricks compressing slightly, the structure sinking into itself. She watched for a long time. She watched until the light was gone and there was nothing left to watch. And then she lay down in the wagon with her children on either side of her and listened to the rain on the canvas and did not sleep. On the fourth morning, the rain stopped. The silence woke her before the light did. That particular quality of silence that follows rain, deeper than ordinary quiet, as if the world is listening to itself dry out. She was out of the wagon before the children stirred. She walked to the building site in wet grass that soaked her skirt to the knee, and she looked at what 3 days of rain had done. The walls had settled. She could see it clearly in the morning light. The top course was perhaps an inch lower than it had been before the rain began. The exterior faces looked rougher, less even the bricks having shifted slightly against each other as they absorbed the water and their weight increased. The walls looked in that moment like something that had been through an ordeal. Adelie placed her hand flat against the exterior face. She pressed. She pressed harder. She put her shoulder into it and pushed with everything she had. The wall did not move. She went around all four sides and pushed at every section. She pressed at the corners. She pressed at the midpoints of each run. She found no give anywhere. What she found instead, after she had circled the structure twice and tested every foot of it, was something she had not expected. The wall was not just standing, it was standing with a solidity it had not possessed before the rain began. The individual bricks had fused. The moisture had worked its way into every joint and every gap, and as it had done so, the root systems of the grass inside each brick had reached toward the root systems of the surrounding bricks. Grass reaching for grass, roots weaving into roots. The 180 separate pieces of Nebraska earth she had cut and hauled and stacked had become in 3 days of rain something close to a single continuous piece. She stood at the corner of the structure and felt the solid weight of it under her hand and understood something she had not known when she started. Her father had built his cellar from blocks of earth, and the cellar had lasted 20 years. She had thought she understood why. She had thought it was simply a matter of thickness of mass, of having enough material between the inside and the outside. But this was something more than that. The earth was not simply a passive material. It was active. It joined itself together. It reached across gaps and wove itself into whatever was adjacent to it. The walls were not just holding because of their thickness. They were holding because the living root systems inside them were continuing to grow, continuing to bind, continuing to transform what had been a stack of separate bricks into something that was becoming with each passing week more like bedrock. She had lost 3 days she could not afford to lose, but the walls were stronger than they had been before the rain. She went back to the wagon and made breakfast for her children. The cutting ground needed 2 more days to dry before she could work it again. She used the time to gather willow poles from the creek bed, carrying them back in armloads, stacking them beside the building site. She needed poles of specific lengths, 6 to 8 feet as straight as she could find, thick enough to have some rigidity, but light enough that she could lift them. She made 3 trips to the creek and back. Each trip was 1.5 miles round. Each armload left marks on her forearms where the bark cut in. Casper helped carry. His armloads were smaller, but he made the same number of trips, and he did not complain, and he kept pace with her on the return walks, even when she could see from the set of his jaw that his arms were burning. On the 3rd day after the rain, she went back to cutting. The ground came up differently now. The clay had a new quality to it, still bound tight by the root systems, but yielding slightly more cleanly from the moisture that had worked its way down through the soil. The bricks came free with fewer strokes. She worked faster than she had worked before the rain. She cut enough bricks in 2 days to account for some of what she had lost. She did not account for all of it. The frost was still coming. The walls still needed 4 more feet. She could feel the edge of the season in the air every morning. Now a sharpness that had not been there in August, a reminder that the prairie was moving towards something that did not care about her schedule. She worked faster. Ulrich Hartmann arrived on a Tuesday in the 5th week of October. She heard his wagon before she saw it coming from the south, along the line of the creek, a flat-bedded farm wagon pulled by a single-bay horse. The man driving it was older, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades in outdoor work. He had a white beard trimmed close and pale eyes that moved over the building site with the unhurried assessment of someone who understood construction. He stopped the wagon and climbed down without being invited. He walked to the walls, which were now 4 feet tall above the surrounding grade, and ran his hand along the exterior face the same way Ottilie had run hers after the rain. He pressed. He nodded slightly at what he felt. His name, he told her, was Ulrich Hartmann. He lived 4 miles south. He had come to Nebraska in 1880 after years in Russia, and his English carried the layered accent of someone who had learned 3 languages in the wrong order. He said he had watched her working from the road on several occasions. "You cut sod by hand," he said, "like an animal." Ottilie waited. He had a plow, he told her, and a horse that could pull it. A breaking plow, the specific kind designed to cut through prairie sod in long, clean strips. He could lend her both for one day. In return, he would bring his mending and washing, which had accumulated over the past months, into a quantity he described with some understatement as significant. It was not a fair trade. They both understood this without saying it. One day with a horse and breaking plow was worth weeks of hand labor. The mending and washing he described, however much there was of it, was worth a fraction of that. He was offering charity wrapped in the form of an exchange because this was how things were done on the frontier, where accepting help outright carried a weight that most people found harder to bear than the work itself. Ottilie's hands were cracked along every knuckle. Her back had not stopped hurting in 3 weeks. The walls were 4 feet tall and needed to be 5, and then she still had the roof, and she had perhaps 4 weeks before the first killing freeze, if the weather was kind, and perhaps 2 if it was not. She thought about what it meant to accept this. She had built every brick of these walls herself. She had cut them and hauled them and set them in place without anyone's help. There was a kind of knowledge that lived in that fact, not pride exactly, but something more functional than pride. The knowledge that she had done it, that it was possible, that she was the kind of person who could do it. Accepting help changed the nature of that knowledge in some way she could not quite articulate. And then she looked at the walls. 4 feet tall, 1 more foot needed, weeks of work remaining, a frost that did not negotiate. Ulrich Hartmann had not come here out of pity. He had told her directly that he had watched her working, and what he had seen had not discouraged him from making this offer. He was not offering help because he thought she was failing. He was offering it because it was efficient, because one day of a horse and plow was a reasonable response to a problem that a horse and plow could solve. Pride told her to refuse. Everything else told her to accept. "Yes," she said, "I accept." The next morning, Ulrich arrived at first light with the bay horse and the breaking plow. Ottilie had marked the cutting lines the night before. She led him to the cutting ground and showed him what she needed, and he hitched the horse and set the plow blade and began to work. In 8 hours, she cut more sod than she had cut by hand in 3 weeks. The breaking plow moved through the prairie root system the way a knife moves through bread cleanly and completely, leaving long strips of sod curling up from the blade in continuous ribbons. She followed behind the plow, cutting the ribbons into brick lengths, with the spade stacking them on the tarp, hauling them to the building site. The work that had been consuming every hour of every day for weeks became, with a horse and the right tool, something that a person could actually do. By the time the light failed, she had cut enough bricks for the remaining wall height, enough for the roof, enough banked against the exterior walls, for extra insulation enough to give her a margin she had never had before. That evening, Ulrich loaded his washed and mended belongings into the wagon without ceremony. He did not say goodbye. He had given what he had offered to give, and the exchange was complete, and sentiment was not part of the arrangement. He simply climbed onto the wagon seat and turned the horse south and left. Ottilie stood beside the cutting ground in the last of the evening light and watched him go. She had accepted help. She had let someone see clearly that there was something she could not do alone, and she had said yes to what was offered, and she was still standing. The walls were still rising, the house was still possible, and the knowledge she had built over the past weeks was still entirely hers. It had not been diminished by one day of a borrowed horse. If anything, it was more complete now because she understood something she had not understood before. Practicality was not the opposite of strength. It was the purest expression of it. She went back to work. The walls reached 5 feet above the surrounding grade on the 1st of October. She stood on the floor of the foundation pit and looked up at them, and for the first time since August, she allowed herself a moment of something that was not planning or calculating or working. The walls were there, they were solid, they were hers. 5 feet above grade, 2 feet of foundation, below 7 feet total, 2 feet thick on all four sides. The root systems inside them still growing, still binding, still doing the slow, invisible work of becoming something permanent. Now, the roof. She had been thinking about the roof since August. She had been thinking about it with the specific, focused dread that you bring to the most difficult part of any task, the part you can see coming from a long way off and cannot yet do anything about. The ridgepole was the central problem. Rutherford Krug had been explicit, 3 strong men to lift it into position. She did not have 3 strong men. She had herself. The willow poles she had gathered from the creek were stacked beside the building site. She selected the 3 longest and straightest ones and laid them side by side. Each pole was perhaps 15 pounds. 3 poles together, even lashed tightly, were still only 45 pounds, well within what she could lift. The question was geometry. The question was how to get 45 pounds of bundled pole from the ground to the tops of 5-foot walls and hold it there while she secured both ends. She built a frame from 2 longer poles, leaning them against the completed end walls like a tent skeleton, their peaks crossed and lashed where they met above the center of the building. She ran a length of rope over the peak of this A-frame, creating the simplest possible mechanical advantage. She tied one end of the rope to the bundled ridge beam. She held the other end in her hands. She pulled. The bundled poles rose 6 inches, 1 foot, 2 feet, 3. She could feel the weight of them translated through the rope into her arms and shoulders, and back everything that had already been carrying everything for weeks now being asked to carry a little more. The poles swayed as they rose. She compensated with her body leaning against the pole, keeping the load centered under the peak of the A-frame. 4 feet, the top of the walls was close. Then the lashing slipped. The bundled poles twisted in the rope. One of the outer poles slid free of the binding she had tied, and the whole assembly shifted suddenly sideways, the weight redistributing in a way that pulled the rope at an angle it was not meant to handle. The A-frame moved. Ottilie threw herself against the near leg of the A-frame with her shoulder bracing it with her body weight, while she grabbed the loose pole with her free hand and tried to work it back into alignment without letting go of the rope or letting the whole structure collapse. The rope cut into her palm through the cloth she had wrapped around her hand as a precaution. The poles swayed. For one long moment, the entire assembly hung in a kind of suspension, not falling and not secured, waiting to go one way or the other depending on what happened in the next few seconds. She retied the lashing with shaking hands. She had done it wrong the first time, rushing, trusting a knot that was not quite finished. She did not rush this time. She tied each wrap carefully. She tested the binding with her weight before she trusted it. Then she resumed hauling. The beam rose to the level of the wall tops. Then the A-frame cracked. The near leg had a weak place she had not seen in the creek bed light when she chose the poles. a notch in the wood where a branch had once been the kind of structural flaw that is invisible until exactly the wrong moment. The legs split with a sound like a rifle shot, sharp and final, and the A-frame lurched sideways and the ridge beam dropped out of the rope entirely and landed across the top of the wall, half on and half off, one end resting on the sod and one end hanging over empty air. Oddly moved before she had time to think about it, she had built a ramp of stacked bricks against the outside of the end wall for placing the highest courses. She went up that ramp in 2 steps and got her hands on the hanging end of the ridge beam and shoved. The beam was 45 pounds. She was pushing it sideways across a rough sod surface with whatever leverage she could find in her position, which was not much. She used her shoulder. She used her hip. She got one foot up onto the wall top and drove her legs straight and pushed with everything in her body. The ridge beam moved. Inch by inch, it slid across the wall top toward the center. She kept pushing. Her vision went dark at the edges from the effort. She kept pushing. The beam found the position she had prepared for it, the 2-notch supports she had set into the end walls weeks earlier against this moment, and settled into them with a finality that she felt in her arms before she understood it. She sat down on top of the wall. The sun was going down. Her hands were bleeding where the rope had cut through the cloth wrapping. Her back had a new quality of pain that had not been there before, something deep and specific. Below her, Casper was standing with his hands pressed flat against his sides, not crying but not far from it. "It's all right," Ottilie called down to him. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat. "It's all right, we're almost done." She was not almost done. She had rafters to set, brush to lay under the roof, sod tar paper to unroll over the brush. Before the sod went on a door to hang the window, to install the stove, to connect a chimney pipe to run through the roof without creating a gap that would let the cold in. She had 100 details standing between this moment and the day she could move her children out of the wagon and into a house. She was not almost done, but the ridgepole was in position. Rutherford Krug had said it required 3 strong men. She had done it alone. She had done it with rope and geometry and the willingness to climb a wall in the last light of an October evening and push with everything she had until the thing was where it needed to be. She climbed down from the wall. Casper came and stood beside her. He looked at the ridgepole sitting in its notches across the top of the walls. He looked at his mother. He did not say anything. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was bleeding less, and held it. They stood there together for a while. October 10th, 1887. The air was cold enough now that her breath was visible in the evening light. The stars were coming out above the Nebraska prairie, hard and bright and indifferent. Somewhere on the claim, a coyote called once and was answered by silence. After the children slept, she went back out. She touched the exterior wall of the house in the dark, cool under her hand, solid, absolutely solid. 2 feet of Nebraska earth roots still growing inside it, binding it into something that would hold through whatever came next. She went back inside and slept. The house was finished on the 10th of October. Ottilie stood outside in the late afternoon light and looked at what she had built. 10 feet by 12, walls 2 feet thick and 5 feet tall above the sunken floor. A sod roof that would leak in heavy rain, but would hold through anything short of a tornado. One window facing south, the glass she had carried 4 miles from town, installed in a frame of salvaged wagon boards. A door of the same boards hung on leather hinges, latched with a wooden bar she had shaped herself with the handsaw over the course of 2 evenings. It was the smallest house in Custer County. It had cost $2.60, $1.12 for the window glass, the rest for nails and the few feet of tar paper Dorothea Fenwick had found in her barn and brought over without being asked. Everything else had come from the earth itself, free and abundant, waiting to be cut and stacked by anyone willing to do the cutting and the stacking. She opened the door and went inside. The cook stove stood against the north wall, connected to a length of chimney pipe she had run up through a carefully sealed opening in the roof. The dirt floor was packed hard from weeks of being walked on during construction. The walls rose around the interior space in their rough living way, the grass roots visible here and there in cross-section where the bricks had been cut cleanly. The single window threw a rectangle of late afternoon light across the floor that moved slowly as the sun descended. Casper claimed the spot nearest the stove. Lisa wanted to sleep by the window so she could see the stars. Ottilie stood in the doorway and watched her children settle into the house she had built with her own hands. Her back ached. Her hands were scarred in ways they had not been in August. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose and would spend the winter trying to recover. But they had a roof, they had walls, they had a stove and a window and a door that latched from the inside. That night, for the first time since Harlan left, Ottilie slept without dreaming of failure. The weeks between the house's completion and the first hard freeze were a different kind of work. Fuel above everything else. The stove would be the difference between living and dying once the temperature dropped and the stove needed feeding. She gathered twisted grass dried and bundled it into tight cylinders. She collected buffalo chips from the low ground where the animals had grazed through the summer. She cut dried stalks and stacked them against the exterior south wall until the pile was taller than Casper. Dorothea Fenwick came by twice in October, once with more tar paper traded for mending, once simply to see how the house had settled. She walked through the interior with the careful attention of someone recalibrating a previous assessment. She pressed her palm against the interior wall surface and noted the temperature difference between inside and outside without the stove burning. "It holds the air differently than a frame house," she said. "It holds everything differently," Ottilie told her. Ulrich Hartmann came once in early November with a quarter of venison wrapped in cloth. He said it was from a deer that would have spoiled anyway. Ottilie accepted it without argument because she understood the etiquette of frontier generosity and because the meat was real and her children needed it. A neighbor 2 miles east, a quiet man named Drescher, who kept careful records of everything, had lent her a small mercury thermometer mounted on a wooden board in late October, saying he had a spare and thought it might be useful to her given her situation. She hung it on the exterior shawl beside the door and began reading it each morning and evening, adding the numbers to the running calculations she kept in her head. The first truly cold night arrived in mid-November. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees below zero. She built a moderate fire and watched what happened. The interior temperature settled at 52 degrees. She sat within this fact for a long time. Outside 14 below, inside 52 above. The differential was 66 degrees. She had not insulated the house with anything beyond the sod walls themselves and the snow she had banked against the exterior in the weeks since completion. No additional material, no special technique, just 2 feet of earth roots still growing inside it, and the basic physics of mass and density doing what mass and density do. She noticed something else that night. She let the fire die to coals before she went to sleep. She woke at 4 in the morning and checked the thermometer she had moved inside near the door. 38 degrees. The fire had been coals for 5 hours. Outside, it was still 14 below. The walls were not just blocking the cold, they were holding the warmth. She pressed her hand against the interior wall surface in the dark. It was cool, but not cold. Cooler than the air in the room, but warmer than it had any right to be, given what was happening on the other side of it. The earth had absorbed the heat the stove had put into it over the course of the evening, the way stone absorbs heat from the sun, and now in the long, cold hours before dawn, it was releasing that heat back into the space slowly and steadily, without drama, without any assistance from her at all. Her father had known this. He had built a cellar from blocks of earth, and it had stayed cool in summer and above freezing in winter. She had understood it intellectually as a child watching him work. She understood it now in a completely different way, standing in the dark in her sod house at 4 in the morning with her children sleeping warm beside the coal stove. She understood it with her body. Rutherford Krug came by in the second week of December. He had not visited since August, since the morning he had ridden away, after telling her that her children would freeze in her half-built structure. He rode up to the house, which was buried to its window in drifted snow from the season's first significant storm, and dismounted and stood looking at the smoke rising from the chimney for a moment before he knocked. Ottilie opened the door. He looked at her. He looked past her at the interior, at the children at the walls. "You're still here," he said. "We're still here," she said. He did not ask to come in, and she did not invite him. Some distances that open between people cannot be closed with small gestures, and they both understood this without discussing it. He stood in the cold outside the door, and she stood in the warmth inside it, and they spoke across the threshold. "This cold is nothing," he said finally. "Wait until January, a real blizzard. Those thin walls won't hold." "The walls are 2 feet thick," she said. "Sod isn't wood. Sod isn't stone. Sod is dirt with grass in it." She did not argue. She had stopped needing to argue about the walls weeks ago. She knew what they were. She had built them with her hands, and she had felt what they did on the coldest nights. And Rutherford Krug's skepticism could not change the temperature, reading on the thermometer she checked each morning. He shook his head. 1 mile winter doesn't prove anything. Don't mistake luck for skill." He rode away without saying goodbye. Ottilie watched him go. He was not entirely wrong about the untested part. The winter had been cold, but not catastrophic. No blizzards, no killing storms. She looked at her fuel supply. She had perhaps 3 weeks of heavy burning available, maybe 4 if she rationed carefully. She needed more. She spent December gathering everything she could find, working the low ground for buffalo chips cutting, and bundling grass, collecting anything combustible within a mile of the house. By the end of December, she had perhaps 5 weeks of fuel. She hoped it would be enough. The new year arrived cold and stayed cold. January brought temperatures she had not experienced before. Not in Saxony, and not in the years she had spent in America before coming to Nebraska. 20 below, 25. On the night of the 5th of January, the mercury retreated to 30 below and stayed there for 3 days. She burned fuel faster than she wanted to, keeping the stove going through the long nights, watching the interior temperature hold between 45 and 50 degrees, while the world outside the 2-foot walls existed in conditions that were simply incompatible with human life. She was burning through her reserves. She noted this with the same practical attention she brought to everything. Calculated, adjusted, burned less at night, trusting the walls to hold what the daytime fire had put into them. It worked well enough. The interior temperature dropped to the mid-30s by early morning. On the coldest nights, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough to make her grateful for every blanket she owned, but not cold enough to threaten her children's survival. Then on the 11th of January, the weather broke. She woke to sunlight streaming through the south-facing window and lay still for a moment, trying to understand what was different. The quality of the light. It was the full direct light of a sun that was actually warming something, not the pale winter light that illuminates without heating. She got up and checked the outside thermometer, 30 degrees above zero. She stood at the door and opened it and felt the air on her face. It was cold, but it was the cold of late autumn, not the cold of a Nebraska January. Somewhere in the night, the Arctic pressure that had been sitting on the region for weeks had lifted, replaced by something coming up from the south, warmer air flowing into the vacuum like water into an empty vessel. Casper asked immediately if he could go outside without his coat. She said yes. He ran out into the mild morning, his breath barely visible, his feet crunching through the snow crust. He had been inside for the better part of 3 weeks. The release of it, the physical freedom of open space after the close quarters of the 10 by 12 interior, was visible in every movement he made. Ottilie watched him from the doorway and felt something ease in her chest that she had not realized was clenched. Then she looked at the northwestern horizon. It was nothing, a slight darkening at the very edge of visibility, but the air was warm and the sky overhead was clear. She thought about what the old-timers said about weather that changed too fast. She went inside and got her coat. She spent the rest of the day gathering fuel. She worked with a focused urgency she could not fully explain to herself. The temperature was mild. Her fuel supply was adequate for several more weeks of careful burning. There was no logical reason to spend a warm day gathering more of what she already had. But the logic that governed her behavior on the 11th of January was not the logic of calculation. It was the logic of someone who had spent 5 months learning to read the land she lived on, who had grown up in Saxony watching her father watch the ski, and who had found something in the air that morning that her body understood before her mind caught up. By evening, she had added 2 more days of fuel to her supply. She went to sleep with the fire banked low, trusting the walls to hold the day's warmth through the night. She slept poorly. She woke 3 times in the dark to check on the children, to listen to the wind that was not yet blowing, to feel the quality of the air in the house and find it unchanged. The silence outside had a weight to it, a heaviness, the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting. She told herself she was being foolish. She went back to sleep. The morning of January 12th began with sunshine. She woke to light streaming through the south window, the same mild warmth she had felt the day before. The interior of the house was 42 degrees, cool but not uncomfortable. She built a small fire to take the edge off and began preparing breakfast. Casper was restless in the way of children who have been reminded that the world outside exists and cannot stop thinking about it. He asked to go outside. "Stay close," she told him. "Don't go past the fuel pile." He promised and ran out the door into the mild morning. Liesel was still under her blankets near the window. She had been quieter than usual for the past few days, and oddly had noticed a cough that appeared sometimes in the mornings and sometimes in the evenings, the dry, shallow cough of a respiratory irritation that could be nothing or could be the beginning of something. She had been watching it without saying anything, the way she watched everything, filing the information and waiting for more. She pressed her hand to Liesel's forehead. Normal, she exhaled slowly. Then she looked through the window at the northwestern horizon. What she had seen the day before as a slight darkening was something else now. It was a wall, a gray-white mass stretching the full width of the horizon, filling the sky from ground level upward, moving toward her with a visible, measurable speed, not the slow drift of ordinary weather. Movement she could track with her eye in real time, like watching a wave cross open water, except that what was crossing toward her was not water, but something colder than anything she had felt in her 29 years. She opened the door. The wind had shifted. The day before, it had come gently from the south, carrying the warmth that had fooled everyone in the county into putting away their heaviest coats. Now it came from the northwest, and it was no longer gentle. She could feel it on her face, a different quality of cold than what the thermometer measured, something that cut rather than simply surrounded. The temperature was dropping as she stood there. She could feel it dropping. Casper was 200 yards away near the low ground where the buffalo chips collected. He was bent over examining something in the snow. He had not looked up. "Casper," she called, "come inside." He looked up at her call and started walking back, not hurrying the unhurried walk of a child who has been promised he can stay out longer. The wall of white hit before he had covered 50 yards. One moment she could see her son clearly, a small figure in a dark coat moving across the white expanse of the snow-covered claim. The next moment he was gone, not obscured, gone. The snow arrived not as individual flakes, but as a substance, a moving mass of white that filled every cubic foot of air between her and where her son had been standing. The wind struck at the same instant, a physical blow that knocked her back against the doorframe, and the temperature dropped so fast and so far that she gasped, the cold searing her lungs on the inhale. She went into the snow. She could not see her hand when she extended it in front of her face. The wind was screaming a sound that was not like any wind she had heard before. Not a howl, but a sustained roar. The sound of something enormous moving very fast through a narrow space. The snow drove horizontally, filling her eyes and her mouth the moment she opened them. She stopped. She made herself stop. She made herself think. The wind was from the northwest. She had been facing north when she called to Casper. He had been moving toward her from the southeast. She turned her back to the wind, which meant she was facing southeast. She began to walk, counting steps, keeping her back exactly perpendicular to the wind pressure, trusting the count in the direction because she had nothing else to trust. 10 steps, 20, 30. At 37 steps, she ran into something solid. She grabbed it. It was Casper. He was standing completely still in the whiteout, both arms at his sides, not moving, not calling out, simply standing in the stoplight way of a child who has been so frightened that all the instructions his body knows have canceled each other out. She grabbed his arm and pulled him against her and turned back into the wind, which meant northwest, which meant toward the house. She could not see. She could not hear her own voice above the roar. She could only feel the wind and the child in her grip and the ground under her feet, and she walked into all of it, counting again, leaning forward against the pressure, keeping her body angled into the storm. Her shoulder hit the wall. She had found it. She felt along the sod surface with her free hand rough and solid beneath her palm, and moved along it until she found the door frame and then the door itself. She lifted the latch which the wind was holding shut and threw her weight against it and pulled Casper through ahead of her and followed him in and put her back against the door and held it closed while the wind tried to tear it from its hinges. The silence inside was not silence at all. The storm was audible through the walls, a sustained roar that made the interior air vibrate. But they were inside and the walls were between them and what was happening outside. Liesel was awake, sitting up in her blankets, her eyes wide. Ottilie locked the door. She stripped Casper's coat and boots and wrapped him in blankets. His hands were white at the fingertips, the color of something that has been drained of what it needs. She rubbed them between her own hands, firm and continuous, until the color began to come back, first pink, then red, then the ordinary color of a child's hands. He shook so hard, his teeth knocked together. She held him and kept rubbing and told him in German that it was all right. They were inside, the walls were here, it was all right. When the shaking slowed, she went to Liesel. The child was flushed, not the flush of cold or of fear. This was a different flush, deeper, sitting in the cheeks in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Ottilie pressed her palm to her daughter's forehead and felt the heat before her hand made full contact. She pressed harder. Unmistakable. The cough she had been watching for 3 days was not nothing. She looked at the door, still vibrating in its frame against the force of the storm. She looked at the walls, holding steady, not a crack of outside air finding its way through. She looked at her daughter and then at the door again, calculating the distance to the nearest neighbor, 2 miles north, the Fenwicks, 2 miles in a storm that had just taken her son from her sight at 200 yards. There was no help to go for. She was alone with a son who had nearly frozen and a daughter burning with fever in a house she had built herself in the middle of the worst storm that had ever come down out of the Northwest and crossed Nebraska. Whatever happened next was going to happen inside these walls. She built the fire up. The storm intensified through the afternoon and into the evening. The sound of it was unlike anything she had known, a constant violence of wind and driven snow that shook the small house at irregular intervals in gusts that felt personal, as if the storm were making individual attempts on specific points of the structure. The door rattled. The window vibrated in its salvaged wood frame. Snow hissed against the exterior walls with a dry scraping sound like sand thrown against stone. The walls did not move. Ottilie touched them as the hours passed, moving around the interior, pressing her palms flat against the sod surface at different heights, feeling for cold penetration, for any sign that the mass of earth between her and the storm was failing. She found none. The interior surface was cool to the touch, cooler than the air in the room, but not cold. The 2 feet of earth between her hand and the outside air were absorbing everything the storm threw at them and transmitting only the faintest trace of it inward. Liesel's fever climbed through the afternoon. By evening, the child was restless, turning in her blankets, pushing them off, and then shivering and pulling them back. Ottilie kept the cold cloth on her forehead, replacing it with fresh water from the bucket every 20 minutes. The bucket had not frozen. Even here, even on this night, the interior of the house stayed above 32 degrees without effort. She checked the outside thermometer through the window, holding the lamp close to read it. The mercury had retreated below the lowest graduation on the scale, below 40 below. She pulled back from the window, inside 45 degrees with the fire burning moderate. She checked her fuel supply. She had burned more than she had planned. The storm had been going for 10 hours and showed no sign of relenting, and she had been keeping the fire higher than she might have on an ordinary night because of Liesel's fever and because of the shock that Casper had come in with, and because the sustained roar of the storm was a psychological pressure that made the fire feel like the only counter-argument available. She did the arithmetic. If she continued burning at this rate, she would run out of fuel in approximately 8 hours. The storm had not shown her any sign of when it intended to stop. If she ran out of fuel before the storm ended with a sick child and no neighbor within reach, and no possibility of gathering more, the fire going out was not a problem that had a solution. She looked at the walls. She had built them in August from the earth that was here free and available to anyone willing to cut it and stack it. She had tested them through November and December and the first bitter weeks of January. She had lain awake in the small hours and pressed her hands against them and felt what they held. She had watched the mercury on the inside thermometer hold at 38 degrees on the coldest nights after the fire had been coals for 6 hours. She let the fire die down. Not out, down. She reduced it to the smallest configuration that would stay alive without tending a handful of compressed grass over the remaining coals, enough to maintain the combustion without consuming what she had left. And then she put the remaining fuel to one side and she pulled every blanket and coat and piece of fabric they owned onto the bed where her children lay, and she climbed in between them and pulled them both against her body, sharing what the walls could not provide, sharing the warmth of the only other heat source in the house. The interior temperature dropped, 42, 40, 38. She watched the inside thermometer in the dim light of the coals. Liesel was breathing in the ragged, effortful way of a child whose body is fighting something hard. Casper had his eyes open, watching his mother watch the thermometer. "Is she going to die?" he asked. Ottilie wet the cloth in the bucket water, which was cold but not frozen, and pressed it to Liesel's forehead. "No," she said. She said it the way she had said things through the past 5 months. Not as hope, as a statement of what she intended to be true, offered to the situation as a declaration rather than a question. 36 degrees. The mercury stopped. She stared at it. She brought the lamp closer to make sure she was reading it correctly. The lamp was burning its last quarter-inch of oil. In its guttering light, the mercury line held at 36 degrees, motionless, going neither up nor down. Outside below, 40 below. Wind at speeds that had taken her son from her sight at 200 yards and nearly taken him permanently. Snow packed against the walls in drifts that would bury the house to the roofline by morning. Inside, 36 degrees. She touched the wall beside the bed. It was cool, not cold. Cool in the specific way of something that is warmer than the air surrounding it should logically allow warmer because it had stored warmth in its mass and was releasing it now slowly and steadily, the way a stone releases the heat of an afternoon sun hours after the sun is gone. The earth was not just blocking the cold. It was giving back what it had taken in during the warmer days, during all the days she had built and worked and moved through the interior space, all the heat the stove had put into the air, and the walls had absorbed all of it, returning now released at exactly the rate needed to hold the interior at the temperature it was holding. She did not know the word for what was happening. She would never know the word for it, but she understood it with complete clarity, holding her children in a house she had built from nothing on a piece of ground everyone had told her would kill her. The earth was not her enemy. It had never been her enemy. It was the only thing that had been on her side from the beginning, waiting to be asked correctly, waiting to be cut and stacked and trusted. She had asked correctly. Sometime before dawn, Liesel's fever broke. Ottilie felt it happen. The dry heat under her palms softened. The child's breathing changed, deepening. losing the effortful quality it had carried through the night. Liesel sighed once a long, complete exhalation and turned toward her mother and slept with the full weight of someone who has finished fighting something difficult and been allowed to rest. Casper was already asleep against Ottilie's other side, his breath slow and even, the shaking long finished. She lay between her children in the 36-degree dark and listened to the storm outside the walls. She did not sleep. She was not capable of sleep, but she was still, which was its own kind of rest. By mid-morning, the wind had died, not gradually. It simply stopped the way extreme weather sometimes stops, as if a door has been closed somewhere very far away. The roaring that had filled the house for nearly 20 hours ceased all at once, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against the ears. Then slowly other sounds returned. The settling of the structure, the faint creak of the door in its frame, somewhere outside a bird. Ottilie opened the door. Snow had drifted 4 feet high against the entrance. She pushed through it, climbing over the packed mass, and stood in the light outside the house. The world had been erased. Every familiar feature of the claim, the fuel pile, the path to the cutting ground, the line of the creek bed 3/4 of a mile east, the distant dark line of the Fenwick farm to the north, all of it was gone. Buried under a white expanse that stretched to every horizon unmarked and absolute, the prairie returned to its original blankness as if none of the human activity of the past 5 months had ever occurred. The sky was clear, impossibly clear. The hard, brilliant blue of a plains winter sky after a major storm so bright it made her eyes water immediately. She turned and looked at her house. The sod walls rose from the drifts as if they had grown there, which in a sense they had. Snow was packed against every exterior surface, bearing the structure nearly to the roof line, covering the window she had carried 4 miles from town on a cold October morning. But the chimney pipe rose above all of it, straight and clear, and from it came a thin thread of smoke, rising into the windless air in a perfectly vertical line. The walls were standing, every inch of them. Not a collapse, not a section that had given way under the weight of drifted snow, not a corner that had crumbled under the combined assault of wind and cold, and the simple enormous pressure of what the storm had put against them. 2 feet of Nebraska earth-root systems still alive inside it had held through the worst storm anyone in Custer County had ever seen. She stood in the snow in her bare feet and looked at what she had built and allowed herself one moment of something she had not permitted herself since August. Then she went inside to care for her children. The numbers came in the days that followed, traveling the snow-choked roads in pieces, arriving by word of mouth. The way news always moved on the frontier, from farm to farm, from neighbor to neighbor, each telling, adding detail to the shape of what had happened. 235 people dead across the Great Plains. Some historians would later suggest the true count was higher. A farmer named Grunwald, 12 miles northwest, who had stepped outside to check his livestock and was found frozen 2 days later, 8 feet from his own front door. A family in Dakota Territory who had burned their furniture and then their floorboards and frozen anyway when the fire could not overcome the cold bleeding through their frame walls. In the schoolhouse, a teacher 19 years old, 40 miles east, whose fuel had run out by 3 in the afternoon, with 3 students still in her care in a boarding house 82 yards away, visible through the window. She had tied the children together with rope and led them into the storm. The children died within sight of shelter. The teacher survived, but lost both feet. Ottilie heard this story from Dorothea Fenwick, who came through the drifts 4 days after the storm, with frostbite on 2 fingers and the look of someone who has sat in a cold house counting her children and wondering which of them she will lose first. Dorothea sat at Ottilie's small table and wrapped her hands around a cup of weak coffee and told the story of her own blizzard night. The frost forming on the interior of the frame walls, Ambrose burning 3 days of firewood in one night, then a chair, then a table. The temperature inside the house dropping to 28 degrees before dawn. The children, wrapped in everything they owned, piled together in the corner, farthest from the walls. "We survived," Dorothea said. "Barely." She looked around the interior of the sod house, at the earthen walls, at the packed dirt floor at the window, still intact in its salvaged frame. Her face held something that was not quite an expression, something more like the absence of the certainty that had been there before. "I thought your house was too small," she said. "I thought you were building yourself a coffin." She set down the cup. "I was wrong. You built the only house in this valley that didn't nearly kill its family." Rutherford Krug came in late January. He had spent the 2 weeks since the storm helping neighbors dig out, attending 2 funerals, surveying the damage across the county with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory after a catastrophic loss. He had seen frame houses with frost on the interior walls. He had helped carry the bodies of people who had made the wrong decision at the wrong moment, who had stepped outside to check on something, or had run out of fuel, or had trusted walls that could not hold what they needed to hold. He rode up to the sod house, half buried in its drifts, and sat on his horse for a moment, looking at the smoke rising from the chimney. He dismounted and dug through the drift to reach the door. Ottilie opened it before he knocked. She was thin, thinner than she had been in August, thinner than when he had last seen her in December. But she was standing. Behind her, Casper and Liesel were on the floor near the stove, playing some game that involved small stones arranged in patterns. The ordinary sound of children who had come through something they were too young to fully understand. Rutherford stepped inside. He felt the warmth immediately. Not the aggressive heat of a stove burning at full capacity, but the settled ambient warmth of an interior that had been above freezing for months, that had held its temperature through conditions that had defeated every frame structure in the county. He crossed to the near wall and pressed his palm against it. He held it there. He felt what Ottilie had felt on a dozen nights, the cool solidity, the warmth that had no business being there given what was on the other side of it, the quiet evidence of a material doing something that no one had adequately explained to him in 9 years of living on the Nebraska plains. He stood with his hand on the wall for a long time. "I built 3 houses last year with good crews," he said finally. "Frame houses, proper houses. 2 of them nearly killed their families during the storm. The third, the children lost fingers to frostbite. They burned every stick of furniture they owned, keeping the stove going." He paused. "Your dirt house held." He took his hand from the wall. The words came with effort, the specific effort of a man who has been precise about what he knows for a very long time, and is now being asked to be precise about what he got wrong. "I told you those walls wouldn't hold. I told you your children would freeze." He looked at Casper and Liesel. "I was wrong." Ottilie could have said many things. She had earned the right to say many things. She had cut every brick in these walls by hand, hauled them on a canvas tarp, set the ridgepole alone when her jury-rigged system broke, let the fire die in the worst storm in memory, and trusted what she had built and been right. She had been told she would fail by every person who understood the situation better than she did, and she had not failed, and the walls were still here, and her children were still here. She said none of it. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked instead. "It's not good coffee, but it's warm." Rutherford Krug stayed for an hour. He asked about the wall thickness, the foundation depth, the way she had bundled the ridgepoles. He asked about fuel consumption, how much she had burned, why she had let the fire die during the worst of the storm, what the inside temperature had dropped to, and how quickly it had recovered. He was not making conversation. He was taking the information apart and examining each piece with the genuine interest of someone who intends to use what he learns. He left with more questions than answers, but he left understanding something he had not understood when he arrived that morning. In February 6, families came to Ottilie's door asking questions. She answered every one of them. She showed them the wool thickness. She showed them the foundation depth. She explained the bundled ridgepole, the dug-down floor, the way she had banked snow against the exterior walls for additional insulation. She explained it simply and completely, holding back nothing, charging nothing. Dorothea asked her once why she did not charge for the knowledge. Ottilie thought about this for a while. No one should lose a child to cold when the earth offers everything you need to stay warm, she said. She meant it in the most practical possible way. She had not invented sod construction. Settlers across the plains had been building with sod for decades. What she had done was prove in the most definitive way imaginable that the technique worked, that a woman alone could build a structure that would hold when everything else failed, and that the materials required cost nothing because they came from the ground itself, free and available to anyone willing to do the work. If that knowledge could save other families, other children, other parents lying awake in the small hours, pressing their hands against walls, and hoping then the knowledge was not hers to sell, it was hers to give. Cornelius Croft never came to the claim. He had waited patiently through the fall for winter to do what he had calculated it would do, and winter had not cooperated. He turned his attention to other opportunities. Properties where the math had worked out the way he had expected it to land, that was genuinely available situations that did not require him to revise his assessment of what a woman alone with $2.60 could accomplish on 160 acres of Nebraska prairie. His silence was its own form of acknowledgement. Spring came late, as if the prairie needed time to recover from what it had put everyone through. The snow melted in stages, revealing the claim beneath it, in pieces the outline of the cutting ground, the worn paths between the building site and the creek, the small mound of earth that was the sod house sitting solid and unchanged in the returning warmth, as if the winter had been a minor inconvenience. Ottilie planted in April a small section of wheat, a kitchen garden. She was not trying to prove anything larger than what she had already proved. She was trying to build a life from the life she had managed to keep. Casper turned 7 in March. He had spent his 6th year watching his mother build a house from nothing and survive a blizzard that killed hundreds of people. He carried this with him in the quiet way he carried everything, not speaking of it often, but not forgetting it either. He helped with the planting without being asked and without making it known that he was helping. He was his mother's son. Liesel was fully recovered before February ended. She followed her mother through the spring planting, dropping seeds into the furrows Ottilie opened, with the borrowed spade singing German songs in the clear morning air. In 1892, Ottilie proved up her claim. She had lived on it and proved it worked. It survived on it for 5 years, as the Homestead Act required. The land became hers in the full legal sense, 160 acres of Custer County, Nebraska, titled to Ottilie Voss without qualification or condition. Harlan, wherever he had gone with his horse and his $42, and his decision to transfer the risk of failure to the woman he was leaving behind, had no claim on any of it. The law was clear on this point. The land belonged to the person who had improved it. That person was Ottilie. She built a frame house in 1896 when she could finally afford the lumber. A proper house with glass windows, wooden floors, walls that did not grow grass from their seams in wet springs. She built it with hired help, 2 men from town who knew what they were doing, and finished in 2 weeks what had taken her 2 months alone in a desperate August. She kept the sod house standing. She used it for storage then, as a shelter for the chickens through winter, then as a kind of permanent fixture on the property that had stopped needing a justification. The walls that Rutherford Krug had said would kill her children stood through the summers and winters of the decades that followed through. Weather that was sometimes severe and sometimes merely difficult, through the ordinary passage of time that softens all edges and settles all structures into the ground they were built from. Ottilie lived on the claim until her death in 1921. She was 63 years old. Casper and Liesel had both grown up on the land, both learned to read and write English in the schoolhouse 2 miles east. Both moved eventually into lives of their own, while maintaining the specific closeness to their mother that is earned, rather than simply given, the closeness that comes from having gone through something together that cannot be explained to people who were not there. On the day the sod house walls were finally taken down in the winter of 1916, Ottilie kept one brick. It was a 50-pound block of Nebraska earth cut from the prairie in the fall of 1887 with a borrowed spade and two hands that were learning as they worked. The roots of the original grass were still visible in cross-section preserved through nearly 30 years in the dry interior of the structure. The grass itself was long dead, but the roots remained woven through the soil in the dense interlocking pattern she had first felt with her fingers on her second day walking the claim, when she had knelt in the tall grass and pulled up a handful of earth and understood that what she was holding was not just dirt. She placed the brick on the mantle of the frame house beside the window that looked out over the claim. Visitors sometimes asked what it was. She never told them. She did not need to explain. She knew what those walls had done. She knew what they had held and what they had cost and what it had meant to trust them on the coldest night she had ever known, with her children pressed against her, and the mercury stopped at 36 degrees, and the storm outside trying with everything it had to get through 2 feet of earth and root, and the particular stiffness of a woman who had decided on a piece of empty ground in August of 1887 that she was not going to fail. The prairie had tried. She had answered it with the only thing she had, which was also the only thing anyone needs. She had answered it with the earth itself, cut and stacked and trusted. 2 feet of silence that the wind could not break.